Welcome to this webinar on lifelong learning. My name is Audrey Falk, and I'm a professor in the Winston School of Education and Social Policy at Merrimack College in Massachusetts in the United States of America. And I am also a country director for the Northeast region of the United States of America for the International Higher Education Teaching and Learning Association, or HETL. The webinar has been developed in partnership between HETL and Emerald Publishing. To find out more about these organizations, please look out for a follow-up email after the event with links through to resources and information. A few housekeeping and practical points before we start. All delegates are muted, so if you have any questions, which we encourage, then please use the chat box on the panel to the right-hand side of your screen. We will try to address all questions during the session. If you have a question for a specific panelist, then please be sure to flag this in the question box. The content of today's session focuses on lifelong learning. Institutions of higher education are uniquely positioned to support learning and professional development throughout adulthood. Lifelong learning is important for employment, workforce development, and civic engagement, as well as personal satisfaction, well-being, and professional and social networking. Lifelong learning can address educational gaps and offer access to individuals and communities that have been historically disadvantaged. Before we go any further, we would like to invite you to participate in a couple of polls so that we can learn a little bit more about you. The first poll is now available to you on the screen.
Okay, so we'll just give it a minute or so for people to complete that. So where in the world are you today? Okay, so that poll is finished now. So 23% are in Africa, 27% are in Asia, 27% are in Europe, and 23% are in North or South America.
Wow.
Thank you so much. And we have one more poll. This will ask a little bit about you and your role.
Okay, so how would you describe yourself as an academic, a postgraduate researcher, a professional, or other? So again, we'll just give a minute or so for people to fill that in. Okay, so the results on that one are 78% an academic, 9% postgraduate researcher, 4% a professional, and 9% other.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrea, for helping us out with that poll. And thank you to our participants for sharing a little bit about yourselves as we begin our presentation today. I am joined by 4 panelists today to explore how higher education institutions around the world value lifelong learning and are taking active steps to implement lifelong education policies, programs, and practices. Our panelists are Professor Singh, Vice President for Academic Affairs at the American University in the Emirates, Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, Professor Yusra Muzugi, President, Royal University for Women, Bahrain, Mr. Dean Hoke, co-founder and managing partner of Edu Alliance Group in Bloomington, Indiana, United States of America, and in the United Arab Emirates. Ms. Helen Valderrama, Director, Global Engagement and Partnerships, York International, York University, Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Please join me in welcoming our 4 panelists. We will start with having each of the panelists share their opinions and experiences of lifelong learning in the context of higher education. We would like to know how you came to be involved in lifelong learning and why it is important to you. And for this first question, we will follow the same order in which I just introduced our panelists. That's Professor Singh, Professor Muzuki, Mr. Hope, and Ms. Balderrama. You can take turns in that order. So starting with Professor Singh.
Thank you, Audrey. It's an honor for me to be here. And at the outset, let me thank both HETL Association and Emerald for choosing this topic and for providing us this wonderful opportunity to share my thought with my esteemed co-panelists and, of course, learned audience. See, the concept of lifelong learning is not new. I mean, it has been emphasized on numerous occasions and recently through 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, emphasizing on inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. So this provided a very holistic perspective to the concept of lifelong learning. I mean, encompassing all spheres of life, where education is like, it goes beyond simply completion of course registration or completion of a course, where learners can learn whatever they choose to learn, regardless of their age, their formal education, and the reason. I mean, they just want to update their knowledge or a skill, or they would prefer to adapt to the labor market need. So we all are witnessing a very significant transformation in the entire ecosystem of higher education. And in fact, I'm sure you all my co-panelists will agree that COVID caused a major disruption and accelerated the much needed pace of change in the education sector, especially in higher education. And it affected all the critical attributes of higher education. I mean, it affected the modus operandi of the institution. We all got affected. But it was a kind of blessing in disguise, especially for higher education sector. It also compelled us to rethink how learning can better contribute to building more sustainable, more inclusive societies, where people are happy, where people are tolerant, they're agile, and they are global citizens. So this is a complex reality of incredible transformation in the higher education, especially in the student body, which is calling for a very resilient institutions. I mean, we have to, as institution, as higher education provider, we have to respond to the market. So there is a call for very resilient institution. And higher education institutions are witnessing, we all are witnessing non-traditional students. And at the same time, the challenge is that we are preparing them for jobs that don't even exist. And with this significant transformation in higher education, it has become critical that we as higher education provider, we are also serving as centers of lifelong learning. So we started actually a center of lifelong learning called Riada. We diversified our program, our course offering, started offering some short courses, micro-credentials, you know, and we started customizing it based on the need of the local, I should say, labor market, not only global, but local as well, for global citizenship. So there is an immense need for an effective culture of lifelong learning in all higher education institutions to ensure that everyone has the knowledge, the skills, the competencies they need to succeed in their personal and professional lives. And the last point which I would like to highlight, that the World Economic Forum estimates that in today's employment market, skills have a half-life of 5 years. So let's see, the repercussions for higher education's role in this context are huge. Universities can support the lifelong learning for workforce that can meet the demands of the labor market.
Thank you so much, Professor Singh. I'll try and pick up from there, and I think that's such a rich platform to start with. First of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all, wherever you may be. Lovely to have our audience with us today, and really kind of very feeling very privileged and honored to share this webinar with my co-panelists and with Audrey, obviously managing us all and facilitating this conversation. So thank you very much for having me there. And as Professor Singh mentioned, I do think this is such a great topic, and it's one that we've visited and revisited multiple times. And I do find that every time we come back to it, there's a different angle and there's a different perspective that we're picking up on. So I guess for me, there are two things that drive my keen interest in lifelong learning and maybe even life-wide learning. First, fueled by my own background in knowledge management, and that's where my research is. It's very much about continuous learning, about continuous sharing. It's about how do you most effectively help people to manage knowledge, knowledge, capture knowledge, disseminate knowledge, and so on and so forth. And what are the structures that best facilitate this? And the second, I guess, is my role as president. I see this as central to what I do. I see, my role as in terms of ensuring that we have growth on all aspects in the university. So where I work, in the Royal University for Women, it's even more obvious, maybe, or even more critical, I guess. It's a university for women, so we're trying to facilitate continuous learning for all our students and all our participants, all our stakeholders. So in terms of growth, we constantly talk about a growth mindset in the university, a university which not only grows in student numbers, which, as higher education institutions, it's something we all have to deal with, but a growth in research, a growth in our own personal development and learning, and us as individuals. And this can only happen through lifelong learning. And I think there are multiple interpretations of what we mean by that, and it could be directed at our, growth or lifelong learning to aid our professional development, lifelong learning to aid our personal development, lifelong learning to aid our emotional development, and so there are multiple angles of this. And actually, I don't think it's one size fits all, and definitely time will play, and we can come back to the idea of time in a little bit, but I do think that there's an opportunity to tap into different elements of lifelong learning throughout our careers. I do think a couple of points I want to touch on. This idea of the changing trends in the job market have really brought to the fore the importance of lifelong learning. The idea that careers are no longer, jobs are no longer careers, but you change up to something like 7 careers in a lifetime is kind of the latest I've read about the topic. And therefore, keeping yourself up to speed with what's happening and keeping yourself, as one of my good friends used to say, employed and employable is really critical to being able to adjust to the changing market trends. And that again has been exacerbated by the advances in technology. COVID has brought, shone a light on this possibly, but actually it was there. Technology has changed the way we operate, and it changes at a pace that makes us all need to revisit our approaches to learning and to conducting our work. All I have to do is look back to when I started teaching, and I won't say how long ago that was, but when I started teaching, it was a very different world. I have to say, it really was. It's almost unrecognizable from what our teachers do today. So it does kind of put an edge on the importance of lifelong learning, particularly in our professional development. But I do want to stress the idea that lifelong learning should not be directly linked to professional development only. It is critical for professional development, but actually I underscore the importance of lifelong learning for personal development, emotional development, a lot of other areas in our lives that require us to invest in ourselves and in our own learning. Maybe one final point in terms of how we utilize it at the university. We're privileged that, it may seem difficult at times, but we're privileged to operate in a governance structure or a jurisdiction where 3% of our revenue has to be annually dedicated to research and 2% our revenue to professional development. So that puts a lovely little framework and boundary around utilizing, resource, sometimes very scarce resource, to ensuring that we do, fund learning and development, particularly around the professional development area, but also within research. So that gives us a good, opportunity or a very strong opportunity to utilize that resource without feeling that we can, drop it at any time we like. So, so those are the kind of the initial thoughts I have on this point, but maybe I'll leave it at that, and I'll hand over to you, Dean, and we can pick up the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I am going to show my age. I started off working in college work in 1975 and at a small religious school in the United States. And as an urban religious school, one of our priorities was something called continuing education. And so we had the traditional undergraduate school, but nighttime to be able to provide continuing education and new ways and new degrees. We started doing night schools. And there are a number of schools that, of course, have gone down that path. And that was my first experience, and as an admissions officer. So I was used to talking to high school students, but all of a sudden I'm talking to people that are older than me in terms of understanding their roles and what they were looking for in their visions. And I'll come back to that because there's almost a circular pattern that I think we're seeing right now in education that eventually moved into my work in distance education, which I started in around 1998. And so I've also watched that evolution slowly but surely. And COVID, of course, seemed to be the one that, you never want to say, as we've all talked about, you never want to say something like that was a good thing, but it was in terms of education and maybe realization of how teaching could be done and effective teaching. Still issues, but we learned so much during this 2-year period. We probably did 10 years of education in 2 years in terms of our learning. Where I'm starting to see things happen in this whole field of continuing education, lifelong learning, is not only about schools looking at the realities and saying, we need to increase our student body because our traditional students are declining. Particularly in the United States. But even more so, governments are putting more and more pressure on state and local institutions to help deal with employment issues. And that goes beyond just the traditional, let's get a degree. One of the things I may end up talking about later is that the development of stackable credentials, and also very much the issue of, does everybody have to have a degree? And there is a higher and higher conversation level happening, particularly in the state that I'm in Indiana right now, saying, while we're not saying higher education and degrees are not important, we are. But we can't forget about the people that started school and dropped out, or are underserved populations, and where they could fit, particularly in the field of technology. And how do we develop training as higher education institutions? So I'm going to kind of leave it there for now, but I think that's a part of this evolution. In some ways, it almost goes all the way back to night school to me. Ellen?
Thank you. I really have the benefit of having the background and context provided or shared by my colleagues here, my distinguished colleagues. And so perhaps what I would be sharing is my own personal connection with the topic of lifelong learning. And so before I do that, I just would like to greet everyone again. Thank you for joining us. I heard that we are joined by participants from almost all regions of the world. So thank you for your kind interest. I'm Helen Balderrama, and I'm the Director of Global Engagement and Partnerships at York University. Thank you for the organizers. And in terms of the question on my connection with lifelong learning, I actually have a very long and I would say intimate history with the topic of lifelong learning. In 2005, as an early career professional, I was education officer at the UNESCO National Commission in the Philippines. I was part of a technical working group that documented and surveyed more than 100 institutions offering lifelong learning programs in the country. And those programs range from school-based and non-school-based, community-based, skills development, training, professional development programs. Years later, as a higher education manager at the Asia Europe Foundation in Singapore, I then transferred to the policy aspect of lifelong learning, because in that role, I was connecting Asia and Europe research networks, working on making sure that what we recommend for policymakers are research-based initiatives championing lifelong learning. And then I'm not gonna share my age as well, just like Dean perhaps, but fast forward to my current role now at York University. In this position as the lead or one of the leads for our internationalization and global engagement, I continue to champion lifelong learning, this time as it connects and intersects with the global engagement of our students and faculty members. And in particular, with York University committing to the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. So Professor Singh and Professor Muzugi already mentioned how lifelong learning is so much embedded in the vision for SDG 4. And this is what we're trying to do at York University and in my role within York International. And so for me, it is a personal commitment, and I'm applying that through my everyday work, engaging our community of faculty and students. And so with that short introduction, I think I'm gonna leave it at that. I'm gonna talk about a couple of examples later on, and I'm very excited to be part of this conversation, and I look forward to learning from you all.
Thank you so much to each of our panelists for those wonderful introductions. You've raised and highlighted many important themes related to our topic of lifelong learning. I appreciate the holistic perspective on all the different types of learning that we as humans participate in, some of which are focused on our professional development, some of which are focused on our personal development, our emotional development as individuals. And certainly I appreciated your focus on the unique challenges of the times we live in pertaining to COVID, and also incredible advances in technology and how those have truly transformed higher education, even in our own careers and lifetimes. And also very much appreciate the highlighting the Sustainable Development Goals and how lifelong learning can intersect with the Sustainable Development Goals. So a wonderful introduction, and thank you everyone. At this time, we will be transitioning into a focus on specific examples from your institutions or from institutions that you have been focused on over your careers. So if you can, please tell us a little bit about lifelong learning initiatives and activities that you have been a part of, and also tell us a little bit about the challenges that you have faced and the wins and successes that you have begun to see. And we will reverse our order for this question. So we will go from Helen to Dean to Yusra to Abi.
Thank you, Audrey. So just to talk a little bit about York University first, before a couple of examples from our institution. So York University, as Audrey had mentioned, is based in Toronto, Canada. And we are quite a young institution, of course, compared with many others, right? We were established in 1959, just over 60 years. And in the last 60 years has grown to become the third largest in Canada with over 55,000 students. And I would say a very diverse demographics, partly because we are of where we are located in Toronto, but also I think it has been a traditional strength of York University as well, as an institution to champion equity, social justice, and diversity within the community. In 2020, we have committed as a university community to contribute to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so our 5-year plan, our 5-year university academic plan, is called Building a Better Future, right? And this is the SDGs is front and center of this strategy, if you may. And our vision is to create positive change as a community in a world that still faces unprecedented challenges with a pandemic, climate change, poverty, and the continuing inequalities. And so, with this backdrop, I would like to share a couple of initiatives that we see as intersections of lifelong learning. In some circles, the acronym for lifelong learning is LLL, and the SDGs. And so, I'd like to talk a little bit about the globally networked learning. So, I think my colleagues already provided sort of a connection between the educational modalities with what had just happened in the past year and a half or 2 years, right? So we introduced the globally networked learning as a way for us, one, to continue the engagement of our faculty and students, right? Everything was shut down. Nobody can travel. There's no student mobility or exchanges. No faculty member can attend conferences for professional development and research. And so for us, this use of information technologies and creative pedagogical approaches is one way for us to facilitate that continuous engagement. And the other piece as well is about access, right? I talk a little bit about the diversity of our student population, and that is true both social culturally, but also in terms of economics, right? Not many of our students go abroad. Part of the reason is because of the funding required to go for physical mobilities. And so we see GNL, or the Globally Networked Learning, as well as part of access and inclusivity, right? Some of these students will never imagine going abroad, but with the globally networked learning, they can have that connection with their peers, their students around the world, and benefit from the expertise and mentoring of faculty members from our partner institutions. So that's one example. The second example I want to talk about is our new initiative just launched in 2022, what we call the Go Global SDGs in Action Student Challenge. So this is funded, or a seed funded, by the Canadian government. And the idea for this program is to encourage the connection of our student population to the idea of creating change, creating impact around the SDGs. They're not just beneficiaries of our education right now, right? They themselves, as students and student leaders, they can actually create positive change by collaborating with their other students. And so, what are the successes of these two programs? I think we have shown an example that is led or coordinated from a central support unit like York International, but having the benefit and support and collaboration of all of our faculties and faculty members, and also our global partners. So there is a way to connect and create synergies, right? Even from the vantage point of a non-academic unit like us. And we saw the success. In terms of success, we have touched 900 plus students combined from these two different programs, and about 60 plus faculty members as well, and faculty mentors. And so I think I wanted to share those two examples, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation.
Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about some commonalities and some challenges that I've noticed. I've had the privilege of working in the United States. I've also had the privilege of working in United Arab Emirates. I've also worked a little bit in Nigeria and Pakistan and some other places. And one of the commonalities is that I see is this burning desire of students, whether it's traditional students or non-traditional students, to be able to get an education and be able to access it at an affordable price, and to be able to have their employers accept that this is an important thing to do. I think that's one of the critical issues is the buy-in that you need among industry, of course, government, as well as the universities. And we're starting to see more and more tools. Online is certainly one of those. And there's still resistance, I think we can say, to online to some degree. We've seen it in countries in the Middle East, where while everybody went down that path somewhat begrudgingly, there is still some pushback on its legitimacy and need. I can tell you that with absolute certainty, it's going to continue to move forward, and governments understand that and will embrace it more and more. I think they do understand it. That's a bit of my own political statement on things, but I also watch this happen in the United States as well. But I think one of the things that we all need to focus on more is a common problem that we have with our traditional students, but also with our lifelong learning students, and that's retention and completing courses. We think of it differently because a lot of them maybe are not in that classroom, we're not seeing them. And I think we've learned through the COVID experience that we need to put more and more effort into the retention in terms of the student services and in terms of support. And that is true of a freshman student, but that's also true of a 40-year-old student that may be working on some form of certification. And I think the universities in general are addressing that. I think we may have been a little late to the party at times, but I think that's where one of the things we've learned from COVID, and I'm seeing a number of schools, no matter what part of the world, are working harder towards that. If the person has made the motivation and the financial investment to go forward and do this, it's an obligation of the institutions to work with them and not make sure that they don't drop out for fear or whatever that motivation is that might stop them, life at times. They need to be able to work with them. I think I'll kind of stop from there. And Dr. Yusra, please.
Thank you so much. Please call me Yusra, it's easier. So much rich food for thought, Dean and Helen, if I may. And I would like to come back to this idea of dropout maybe a little bit later, and if we get a chance to come back to it. But I wanted to share a couple of things from, I guess, my perspective, possibly focusing a little bit on Royal University for Women, where I'm based at the moment here in Bahrain. At RUW, I think we quickly recognized that there are 3 levels that we need to address in this kind of our approach towards lifelong learning. The first is the closest to home, which is with our own faculty and colleagues. And given what COVID has taught us all, I think many of us assumed that the challenge would be with the students, and realized a little bit later that maybe the bigger challenge was with the academics. And as you said, Dean, the kind of a little bit of resistance to learning new ways of doing things and embracing technology and embracing new methods of learning, etc. So it was probably, for us, for me at least, it was a crash course in crisis management, if you like. So addressing this need to get colleagues, whether academic or admin support, or professional support, as we like to call them, to embrace this idea of lifelong learning was really quite an important thing for us. And we've done different things, and we've recently signed up with one of the largest providers of online learning. I'm not going to mention any names now, but to make it very accessible to people to develop themselves, and to see this as a priority championed at the very top from the university, that this is something that we value and something that we promote and something that is encouraged in the university. So that's kind of at one level, if you like, in terms of internally for us in the university. Then we move on to our students. Our students, as I've mentioned before, are girls, are young ladies who do have possibly different challenges. and you know, they're very strong-willed, they're very motivated, they are very keen to learn, but sometimes need a little bit more support in terms of ensuring that they have the access to the right things. So we've put on a large number of courses, you name it, you know, leadership, cybersecurity, Italian language, French, German, all sorts of things, you know, coaching, mentoring, everything that they could possibly want, and possibly a bit more, in terms of giving them an opportunity to explore and go on this journey of their own learning. The one point I would say here is that as an institution, we can only do so much. We can facilitate the learning, but we can't make it happen. And for me, it's very much about ownership of your learning journey, whether it be the academics, whether it be the professional support staff, or whether it's the students. It really needs to be intrinsic from within for it to happen. And I think that's probably very critical to a successful life learning mechanism or approach within any institution. And then maybe the last layer I wanted to touch on was opening up the university for the community, for our stakeholders, in terms of lifelong learning opportunities. So one of the things I think has worked really well is we've actually opened up our courses, our degree courses, to the community, so people can join you know, a regular degree course without having to be signed up for the degree. You know, I just want to learn a bit more about the history of art. I don't want to do a full, you know, MSc or MA in art. I just want to learn about, you know, I don't know, fashion design or pattern cutting or whatever it is, or negotiation or international business, without necessarily wanting to commit to a full-time degree. And I think that's a very different way of approaching this, saying that, look, you know, you don't want to do the whole thing, that's fine, you know, different courses for horses for courses, whatever they say. So that's kind of one of the areas that we found works and helps us to engage. Now, the beauty with that is it introduces further diversity into the classroom. It introduces diversity in terms of age, in terms of experience, in terms of cultural backgrounds, in terms of expectations, which is actually quite an enriching experience for everyone involved, the teacher or the academic, the students, and the members from the external community. So I think that's a very beneficial way of looking at things. If we were talking about challenges, I think time is one of the biggest things. One of the biggest challenges we've faced is, and I've faced it in a number of institutions, actually. I've worked in the UK as well as in the Gulf. It's that move away from lifelong learning as a nice to have, and getting you know, into the mindset that it's a need to have. It's not the added extra if I've got a bit more time. It's something that is central to what I do on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's not always there, if I'm honest with you. I think that there are challenges. We're all exceptionally busy people. Everybody's got a busy life, and we get busier and busier by the day. And therefore, I think building this, embedding it into our day-to-day activities has to be critical to what we do. You know, if we're going to be successful as you know, as institutions where we all grow. So I'll leave it at that, as some of the challenges, and I'm sure Abby will fill us in a bit more.
Thank you, Isra. Being the last one for any question is a blessing, actually, because you covered a lot of points. I mean, I was reading a report from Coursera, and it revealed that 89% of the students believe a professional certificate will help them stand out to employers. And employers also believe that 76% of them are, I mean, likely to hire a candidate who is having some professional certification. So, I mean, I agree that there are so many commonalities, what you have shared, and what Dean has mentioned, like, you know, in this part of the world, is the challenges are little different than probably other part of the world. There's a huge resistance towards online education.
Yes.
It is still there. It's improving, but it's still there. As an institution, the first step we took was to review our mission, and we added lifelong learning in our institutional mission. The next step was to create opportunities for all through a very structured approach. So what we did, we created a Center for Continued Education. We named it RIADA. which is serving as a lifelong learning incubator with a clear mission to transform individuals and a commitment, to focus on reskilling our graduates, our alumni, who are already working, offering them micro-credentials. So we revisited our policies to accommodate the non-traditional learners, making learning more accessible for them. Especially, we are operating as an institution 7 days a week and 9 to 9. So we are accommodating the needs of working students. So we started offering certifications in collaboration with the industry, like kind of nano degrees, making learning more job relevant, recognizing their prior learning, facilitating the credit accumulation, like they can accumulate their credit and then they go to a degree program, like what Yusra has mentioned, that, okay, fine, I don't want to take the entire degree program, I want to take a couple of courses. But then you have the option, like you can take other courses and you can finish your degree as well. So we offered very flexible learning options, to support the student career growth and make them more employable. But the subject requires attention on two different dimensions. There is a learner himself or herself. His motivation is so much important. His abilities, his KSOs, which we say the knowledge, skills, and abilities, and other competencies. I mean, these are so important for them, especially in lifelong learning. So to unleash the talent of every learner so that people are trained according to their needs, according to their capabilities, and to maximize their potential, it is not only important to strengthen the partnership with the community, with the stakeholders, but also to understand the needs of the learner. So we conducted an alumni survey, and it reported like financial constraint is one of them. Timing is another one. You already mentioned that. Recognition of their credential was also a major challenge. So this required, budget was definitely is one, but the entire certificates or the courses has to be redesigned in a manner which is industry relevant. So it took long time for us to get some of our courses recognized by the industry to attract the non-traditional students. In addition, addressing the challenge of timing was not very easy. So we have to ensure that the mode of delivery makes the learning opportunities and learning spaces more accessible beyond the institution's operating hours. Right? So when we talk about the micro-credential as a flexible, directed way to help the traditional or non-traditional students to develop their required skills, then there are challenges of quality, transparency, comparability, the recognition of the courses, portability if they go to any other country, what is going to happen? This needs to be addressed. And it requires, a kind of consortiums, I think, of university. So what we are doing now, tailoring the education to the demands of the workplace is very important now. It's critical. And I think all the higher education institutions are doing that. We are trying to, we are fostering the dialogue, ensuring the funding. We are having also one point which is more important is having partnerships with other institutions. So that's where we are currently at this point of time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again to each of our panelists for sharing what is happening at your institutions and institutions that you've been a part of at different times over your careers. It's really wonderful to hear all of these examples and give us a sense of what's possible. And I'm hopeful that we are inspiring the interest of our listeners and viewers. I want to point to some of the themes that I've heard in your comments. Firstly, that of who are our stakeholders, and our stakeholders, as you've mentioned, are certainly our current students, as well as our faculty and staff and administration within higher education, but then also those prospective students, those possible students out there, our community members and our community partners. Those are all our stakeholders and all of the individuals we can think about as we're thinking about lifelong learning in higher education. And even globally, right, as Helen identified, we can be thinking about our potential students at a global level. So with technology, technology, we have the opportunity to bring in students from literally all over the world potentially. I appreciated the tension that was mentioned between higher education's interests in retaining students and commitment to supporting students in completing a course or a degree or a certificate, depending upon their goals, but also the point of USRA that ultimately it is the student who needs to own their accountability and responsibility in their learning. I think that's a really, really important point. I also think the points that we've made about context, whether it's the economic context or certainly technological and even public health context right now, and how that impacts lifelong learning and higher education and even forces and encourages change is really important. And then ultimately the idea that lifelong learning connects with organizational and institutional change. We are making changes, and change is hard for institutions, it's hard for society, and how can we do that in ways that move us forward and are respectful of differences as well. And finally, I just want to point to Yusra's point about the opportunities in lifelong learning to facilitate diversity in higher education, that we are able to bring in different kinds of students by bringing in different age groups, different careers, and certainly, again, people across geographic divides. So we have just a small amount of time for one final question from me before we move into questions from any of our audience. So a reminder to all of you that if you do have questions, please start typing those into the chat, because we will be asking for your questions in just a few moments. So in these just few minutes, if any of you have some final recommendations or suggestions for our participants on ways that they can move forward the lifelong learning agenda at their own institutions and in their communities, that would be wonderful. And for this very quick question, we'll go through the order of Dean and then Helen and Abi and Yusra.
Well, very quickly, I think one of the things that must happen, everybody's saying this is important, whether it's in higher education, government, students, etc. But we need someone to lead. And we can wait for people, but I think higher education and its leadership need to, in a sense, be the leaders in terms of pushing forward the agenda of lifelong learning. And what I mean by that is bringing groups together, whether there's symposiums, conferences like we're doing today, webinars, but bringing government leaders, bringing industry into the same table, and in a sense, do the round table to talk in terms of needs and everybody hearing each other. And that's where higher education and its leadership can really help move that agenda forward. It doesn't matter what the size of the institution is. If somebody does that or groups do that, to get that conversation going, that's a very important thing. And I think some of the economic issues, as well as some of the other things, can be addressed directly, and funders may well show to be able to help. I'll leave it there.
Great. I think just to add to what Dean had mentioned in terms of leadership and partnerships, I would really recommend the idea of working across campus and within, so partnerships within and partnerships externally. And I really see this as a key aspect of lifelong learning, because if we recognize that learning doesn't only happen within the walls of the square or the rectangle of the classroom, and it's beyond, right? We need to also look at the kinds of partnerships that we engage, or the kind of partnerships that we form, right? And these partnerships has to be consultative, has to be reciprocal. And I think Abby had mentioned, and user as well, we need to be considering the needs of these stakeholders and partners that we bring to the table. not, we are Canada, we are pushing this agenda to other countries and the other way around, right? If the partnerships for LLL or for lifelong learning is going to work, the respect for reciprocity and knowledge exchange has to be both internal and external. And then I guess the second point that I want to recommend or suggest is the idea of piloting and experimentation, right? I wasn't able to talk earlier about the challenges. I talked about the impact, but there are challenges, just like what that our three colleagues had mentioned. There was pushback, there were faculties having difficulties, but I think the additional perspective that our team from GNL was able to put in there is the idea of, okay, let's try this. This may work or may not work, right? But we try. And this is giving both the students and the faculty members courage and motivation to open their minds. And openness of the mind is so essential in lifelong learning.
Thank you, Dean and Helen. See, I completely agree that industry-university partnership is the key now. I mean, companies like Google, IBM are hiring based on aptitude with no degree required at times. And they are offering in-house training to the next generation of their employees. So is it a threat to the higher education institution? I don't think so. So, but I believe, and I strongly believe actually, that there is an immense need of skill-based education. We all can contribute to make education and learning resilient, but we have to come forward. So nano degrees with strong focus on skills and knowledge, equipping the students to deal with the workplace challenges is required. So if we all agree and if we all recognize that lifelong learning is a human right and it is critical to create resilient community, resilient society, then the issues pertaining to partnerships, the entire learning ecosystem should be addressed. The learning ecosystem should integrate the diverse learning modalities like a blend of formal, non-formal, and informal learning. Thank you.
Thank you. I think being the last to speak is actually much more difficult because everything that's worth saying has already been said. But I'll try and be, well, it doesn't take much to be controversial. I'm going to be a little bit more controversial. I actually think that whilst industry-academia partnerships are critical, I think they are two-legged stools, and we all know that two-legged stools are a little bit wobbly. For me, I think we need to have the regulators firmly at the table with us. Particularly in this part of the world, it's very difficult to push things through without the blessing of the regulator and the framework, the jurisdiction. And therefore, I think the first thing is to make sure that we include the regulators from the very beginning, so that they give their blessing and their approval of these kinds of initiatives. I guess the second point, and I'm sure this won't buy me many friends, but I do think that this is not something that it's not a blanket approach that we can impose on everyone. Lifelong learning needs to be as flexible as we can possibly make it. For it to work, for people to commit, for it to come from within, for it to be intrinsic, we need to make sure that it suits what people are doing. And look, if I go back to when I was doing my PhD, started my career as a teacher, having my family and kids and all that, the last thing I needed at the time was any more learning. It was just about keeping my head afloat. And sometimes you're just not ready to be involved in that kind of thing. You can just keep yourself going. And therefore, I think we have to be wary of making it mandatory. Yes, we can encourage and we can facilitate and we can support. However, I think we have to stop and not make it something that is, you're evaluated against, and because I do think then we're going down a slippery road of people ticking boxes and doing, yes, I did this course because I had to do it, etc. So I'm a big believer in it coming from within, supporting it, ensuring that it is meaningful to those taking part in it. And I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again to each of our panelists. And at this time, we would love to take questions from the chat. If there are questions, you're welcome to type them into the chat, and I will enlist the assistance of our friends from Emerald to share those questions with us if there are questions.
Yes, there's a couple of questions that have come through. So the first one is, what do you think about the use of quantitative methods in the analysis of the learning process in higher education?
Helen, would you like to take that question?
I just want her to repeat the question.
Oh, yeah, sure. It's what do you think about the use of quantitative methods in the analysis of the learning process in higher education?
Yeah, I mean, I can take the question briefly. See, we are in the era of machine learning and data science. So data, there's a flow of data from everywhere. So if we are not going to do a proper analysis, and I will give you a very good example. We started having we used an approach of LinkedIn Learning, right? So we signed a contract with LinkedIn Learning, and we wanted faculty or whoever wants to basically alumni, faculty members, students. If you want to have additional, you want to know something more, please go ahead. Now we have a contract, so you can do that. And we noticed that almost 40% to 45%, they have not completed the course even. So if we are not going to do analyze the data quantitatively, we will never come to know what is happening. So you can come up with good processes, but the analysis of data is definitely required, and that's what is required for lifelong learning as well. We can provide the opportunities, but we need to see when we are providing the opportunities, is the learner benefited? So the data analysis and definitely quantitative data analysis is very helpful.
Can I just add, if you'll allow me, Audrey? I agree with you completely, Abby. I think this is, fundamental in an era where we're inundated by data. We need to be able to filter it and try and make some sense of it. However, I would again caution that we're not adding 1 and 1 and making 5. If we rely solely on quantitative data, we may not be reading the picture correctly. And therefore, I think it is one useful tool amongst many others that we could be using. So our, triangulating our information will probably help us in making a more informed judgment of what's happening.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Andrea, is there another question?
Yeah, we do have a couple more. I think some of them you have answered, but this one is regarding the difficulty around the time for staff to develop learning materials and the cost of some technologies. Do you have any thoughts on either of these things?
I can have a go at it. So in terms of developing tools and materials for training or for retraining or lifelong learning, I think one of the key aspects for us is really look at the internal expertise that we have, right? And so, for example, the globally networked learning, we actually discovered that we have a faculty member who's working on COIL and GNL for a few years, right? Even before the pandemic hit. And so for us, we are quite successful, but one of the main factors why we were successful is because we didn't really start from scratch. We had a basis. We have a faculty member who has an expertise, and what we have done is to support her to roll this initiative across the campus, right? So in terms of thinking about tools and resources, your internal community is one of the major ones. So look around and inquire and really look at those internal resources that you can use or you can partner with to launch any initiative, I think.
And just to add to what Helen has mentioned, that what we do also, we have industry advisory board. So this industry advisory board is also very helpful sometime. So we have like internal resources available, but they also contribute if they have any idea, because they come from industry. So they play a very instrumental role in developing those certifications and the material.
Wonderful. It is now the end of our time together, so I want to once again thank our panelists and thank our participants for a wonderful, informative, and inspiring session. And we hope that you will join us again for future talks sponsored by Heedle and Emerald. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much.
Thank you.